remember two things. Number one, the Russians never fight short wars. They do short intimidations. Their wars are always long because they're always about human waves. Number two, if they do this, this is their last war because there aren't enough Russians under age 20 to theoretically repopulate the system. So when this is done one way or another, Russia is done.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Kate Chabot. And this time we're joined by geopolitical analyst Peter Zeihan. Peter is a best-selling author who's just released an updated version of Accidental about the shape of the world and where we go next. Oh, we could talk about so much, Peter. Welcome back to Frontline. Let's focus on Ukraine. Several possible developments on the political front, which are good news for Ukraine. The announcement this week that the US will send another $1.1 billion Patriot missile system, defense system, to Ukraine in the coming days. That's badly needed, isn't it? But very good news.
Absolutely. You need to look at the Patriot system not in terms of what's been going on for the last several months, but what's going to be on for the next. So the last several months, obviously, the Ukrainians needed more air defense. The Russians were taking advantage of a lull in weapons deliveries to basically hit the Russians with all kinds of air-based weapon systems. And obviously, it would be relevant to get defense for that. But what's really coming up now is the imminent arrival of Western fighter jets, most notably the Mirages from France and the F-16s from the United States and its allies. If the Ukrainians can achieve, even just for brief moments, local air superiority, then the capacities of the capacities of the Ukrainian military to launch offensives changes. Every offensive that the Ukrainians have attempted for the last 12 months has bogged down because they don't have air superiority. And if they can't maneuver functionally with armor and armored vehicles, then they can't move nearly as quickly. They can't move in large number, and it makes it a lot easier for Russian artillery to pick them apart. Well, if you can achieve even just for a few hours a certain blanket, then the tables turn and the Ukrainians can do things like clear mines without having to get shot at from artillery. And you throw a Patriot into that, you throw the new F-16s into that, you combine that with a little bit more liberal restrictions on the Ukrainians' ability to target objects within Russia proper. And you're seeing the Ukrainians already starting to use things like the ATACMS to prep, say, Crimea by basically taking out something like an S-400 air defense system a day for the last week. And the Russians only have 50 of those for their entire country. So we're changing the shape of the battlefield very quickly. You plug a Patriot into that process, and we can actually have perhaps a meaningful counteroffensive this summer.
Interesting that you mentioned those strikes on Russian air defences in occupied Crimea this week, hitting surface-to-air missile systems. It does look like the Ukrainians are exploiting a new weakness here, doesn't it?
Well, the S-400s have always been a bit of a mystery from the American and the NATO point of view, because until you're in a hot war, you have no idea how well the top-of-the-line equipment is going to work. Well, the S-400 is supposedly, pre-war, the most sophisticated anti-missile and anti-aircraft weapon system on the planet, much better supposedly than what the Americans could do. And now we discover it can't deal with rockets. So not only is this taking the Russians down several pegs in terms of their own feeling of their invulnerability, not only is it reducing the interest of countries like India in getting any weapon systems from the Russians, because now they realize they're not all that, it's changing the complexion of what is possible. Because if you can basically in one spot bleed the entire Russian air defense grid, then you're not just talking about a change in the Ukraine war, you're talking about a change in what Russia is capable of. And we're still kind of coming to grips with what that means. This is also new.
So in that light, could it be just literally a matter of time until Ukraine can shut down Russia in Crimea, cut it off and stop Russia's ability to support the war from there?
That is definitely the goal. Even if you don't conquer, reconquer, liberate, whatever word you want to use, Crimea, its military supply basically goes on two routes. There's a rail route that is on the mainland that goes through Mariupol, which is somewhat vulnerable to Ukrainian assault today. And that's the new line. That's the backup line. And then you've got the primary line, which is the Kerch Strait Bridge, which is becoming increasingly vulnerable. And I would argue that if the Ukrainians wanted to take that out today, they could, but they're waiting for more military capacity. And when you do that, Crimea goes from being a launch pad for Russian assaults to simply the most vulnerable part of the Russian landmass. And that's a different sort of complex. So this summer is going to get really interesting. Will the Ukrainians be able to pull this off? Don't know. Everyone like me who saw this war coming, we all made predictions about how this was going to go, and we were all wrong. And then we got new data and we reassessed, and we were all wrong again. I'm just trying to highlight where we're seeing things move and where that might take us.
Yeah, you say this summer could get very interesting. The winter could be quite desperate because President Zelensky has stressed the need for more air defences at the Ukraine Recovery Conference. They've been looking at trying to build up resilience in the energy infrastructure, and really, I mean, he's right, isn't it? Because you can't really talk about resilience before you have the fundamentals in place to protect those systems.
The winter is going to be awful. It doesn't matter really what happens at this point. It's just a question of how much worse does it get. The Russians have basically taken something called the Fab 1500, dusted it off from their Cold War storage, put a Chinese-made flight kit on it, and have glide bombed it in and simply destroyed entire power plants. The Fab 1500 has roughly a metric ton of explosives in it, and it has a blast radius in excess of 3/4 of a kilometer. So you're not talking about sending an Iranian drone into a small transformer station. Some of them can be repaired in a few hours. You're talking about leaving a crater in the ground where a power generation asset used to be. And that's basically the entirety of southern and eastern Ukraine now. So there simply is not enough power. The only way that communities that are kind of east of Kiev and southeast of Kiev are going to have electricity this summer is if it's imported from the European Union. So it's a question now of transmission. Now, luckily, transmission is cheaper to put up than new generation, but yes, it's going to be a cold winter for all concerned.
And on other slightly good news, the US has now lifted a 10-year ban on the Azov Brigade using American weapons over the neo-Nazi ideology of the group's founders, but the unit is now part of Ukraine's National Guard. Does that, along with the US relaxation on the ban over its weapons being used on Russia itself, does that signal a less escalation-phobic US, do you think? Is it the beginnings of that?
That's a very much to be determined conversation. The Russians, by my math, have now set 34 red lines that the West has tiptoed across and then boldly stepped across, with the most recent one being the use of Western military technology to directly strike Russian territory across from the Kharkiv border. This is one of those things where if you have a time machine and you could go back 6 months, you could say that, this line and this line and this line were all simply Russian propaganda intended to make the West self-deter. Maybe we could have moved more aggressively. I understand why so many people want us to move more aggressively. The problem is we only have to be wrong once. So doing this slowly bit where one country, for example, the Brits sending the storm shadows, tiptoe across the line before everyone else gets in, I fully support that strategy. We will never get it perfectly right, but the consequences for getting it wrong are horrendous. As for the Azov battalion specifically, this is a group that is, if they were headquartered anywhere in the Western world, most of their leadership would probably be in prison. But when you talk about neo-Nazi propaganda and fascist ideology, we're now in a situation where the strongest, most aggressive, most hateful fascists in the world are in the Kremlin. And that blurs the lines, for better or for worse.
So you are in favour of a more cautious approach, though, are you, in terms of what when the West is saying you can or you cannot use your weapons in a certain way that we supply?
I'm pretty good at what I do. And I predicted that the war would begin in 2022 back in 2010. I don't have access to the information that is necessary to say that this will work in terms of calling the Russians on a bluff and this won't. I'm not going to second guess the people who are in that position. I just say that I understand the caution, and I think it's prudent.
Ukraine, you mentioned the Mirage jets and also the F-16s. We were waiting for their arrival. Ukraine has also hit one of Russia's advanced Pantsir S-1 air defense systems in Luhansk. Do you think this is in any way a kind of preparation for the arrival of those F-16s? Is it kind of softening up
Absolutely.
process? Do you see it? Yeah, you do. Absolutely.
Yeah,
So we're
no.
going to see
Anything that
more of
you're
these.
seeing that's with has the Ukrainians using any weapon system against air defense that's not in an active combat zone is absolutely about building that zone so they can establish local superiority. We've also seen the Ukrainians go after a radar system that's deep within Russia, a couple hundred kilometers, that was designed primarily for ballistic missile defense. So you're talking about a strategic asset, but it also serves a purpose of detecting aircraft 1,000 kilometers away. So everything is now game, and the better that the Ukrainians can break up that system so it's not a unified network, the easier it will be then for them to achieve that all important local superiority in aircraft.
And those strikes in Russia itself, should they increase, how much of a risk does that present to President Putin himself politically?
Russian politics are quirky on that. It's a strongman system. It's always been a strongman system. And because Putin specifically rules through the intelligence services, which is a combination of rule of terror and rule of infiltration, it's probably pretty stable. It's just that it's pretty brittle. So the Russian government, Putin specifically, is not vulnerable until the day that they are. Um, Looking back along the stretch of history, if you look at the year before every coup or revolution, there was no reason to think anything was wrong. It all boils up very quickly, but you have to have a mass trigger. So, for example, the loss in the Crimea War damaged the czars. The loss in the October Revolution triggered the withdrawal from World War I and the collapse of the czarist system. The Cuban Missile Crisis led to the fall of Khrushchev. You have to have that very short, sharp, painful realization that Russia has lost and lost big, and then the underlying population that has been buying into the propaganda realize it's all wrong, and then the government turns. We're not there yet. I don't think the fall of Crimea even would be enough to do that. But that is really the only thing that's on the short term horizon that would even maybe fall into that category.
So it would have to be something bigger than that, even.
Yes, you'd have to have a mass defeat. So, for example, if the Ukrainians were able to not simply cut that rail line, those rail lines going into Crimea, but actually advance to the coast so that Crimea becomes basically a death camp run by Russians where Russians are dying and starving. Because remember, the Russians destroyed the Kakhovka Dam. There's no more irrigation for agriculture in Crimea at all. So all the food is imported. If you turn that into a very public, globally aware place where the Russians are dying in the streets because they can't get food in, maybe.
If we could just talk a little bit about the state of Russian forces at the moment. Figures obtained by the BBC and an independent Russian media outlet, Media Zone, has said that more Russian fighters had died in the 10-month battle for Bakhmut than in the 10-year Afghan war. And the Ministry of Defence here in the UK has put the total number of Russian casualties since the start of the full-scale invasion at more than 500,000. How is Russia meeting those challenges of replacing its personnel?
I can't comment about Avdiivka or Bakhmut. Those numbers are just too squirrely. I don't want to say that they're wrong. I think they're in the right realm. As for the 500,000 number, I think that's absolutely accurate. Keep in mind, the Russians had 8 million men in their 20s, or at least that's what they started the war with. If they've lost 500,000 now, and 1 million have fled, that still leaves them with 6.5 million bodies to throw at this problem. And to be perfectly blunt, the Russians have yet to fully mobilize. Most of the people that they've brought in through their draft system have been minorities from ethnically disadvantaged, economically disadvantaged areas. They haven't really gotten into the core of what the country is capable of. That's still ahead of us. But at this rate, there's no way the Russians can keep this up for another 8 years. And I know that sounds like a long time. It is. But remember two things. Number one, the Russians never fight short wars. They do short intimidations. Their wars are always long because they're always about human waves. Number two, if they do this, this is their last war because there aren't enough Russians under age 20 to theoretically repopulate the system. So when this is done one way or another, Russia is done.
You said earlier that you correctly predicted when this war would start. Are you then saying that it's going to be 8 years before it ends?
Like I said, everyone who thought they understood how this was going to go has been wrong repeatedly. Uh, this is the most dynamic military conflict we have seen in the world since at least the Crimean conflict in the 1800s, because we're dealing with a technological evolution here that is playing against a massive legacy. So you've got the Soviet legacy, which is the largest armament supply system in the world, and more importantly, the largest armament reserve in the world. That's a lot of hardware to chew through and a lot of inertia when it comes to innovation. On the other side, you've got the information technology revolution that has now, the second generation of it is being married to military affairs, and that's where all the drones are coming from. So we've got a technological revolution happening in very real time with a lot of outside support on both sides in pushing that technological frontier forward. At the same time, there's just this sheer mass of material that has to be blown up. Uh, I don't know how this is going to go, and people are coming up with new tactics every few weeks.
And it's interesting because I was talking to someone this week who was telling me about innovations that the Ukrainians are coming up with, that you can actually get a drone, or they're working on a drone at the moment that can recognize its target by its voice using AI. I mean, when you talk about this, and if you think about the way these kind of innovations and the fact that, I think most people who talk to me about it say that the Ukrainians are actually more innovative than the Russians in this field. So if you can
Oh,
keep the
certainly.
Ukrainians going long enough and supply them, actually they may well be able to turn it and get the in this technology race, actually turn the tide by their innovation, if you can keep them supported for long enough to develop and get things onto the battlefield that they need.
I don't want to rule that out, but I would caution you to consider that people thought the same thing about hypersonics. The problem with single point attack systems is they don't hold territory. They destroy infrastructure, they destroy vehicles, and that's obviously part of war. But that doesn't allow you to win or, more importantly, hold the terrain. The question here is, what are the rules of the old system that still apply? And when I say the old system, I'm not talking industrialization. I'm talking like spears and arrows physically holding territory versus what of the newer old system industrialization will hold versus what will hold of the new system, and we figure that out as we go. I mean, there are very, very good reasons why the French, the Brits, and the Germans all sent observers to America's Civil War, because there were new things in play and no one really understood how they fit together. We're all watching this with huge interest, and the implications for the next 40 years are immense.
Mm. Just to return to how Russians are recruiting their soldiers, just briefly, there have been reports this week. I want to get your perspective on this. That two retired Sri Lankan generals have been arrested on suspicion of having being recruiting agents supplying Russian mercenary groups. That Sri Lankan citizens have been duped into combat roles in Ukraine. I mean, are those desperate measures, or is it par for the course things that have been going on the whole time that we've just not seen reported very much in the media?
I would argue that it's been going on since the first year of the war. Now, whether these two specific generals are responsible for basically rounding people up, I don't have the evidence of that one way or the other. But remember that a few years ago, Sri Lanka suffered a massive economic dislocation, and people were desperate to get whatever they could get. And the Russians signed a series of deals that would allow Russians to be basically tourists in Sri Lanka. And that had established a bit of a back and forth in which people could move as well. So the idea that there's Sri Lankans fighting in Ukraine, that doesn't surprise me at all. There are Nigerians fighting in Ukraine. There are exchange students that the Russians have press ganged into fighting in Ukraine. So this is not a new strategy for the Russians. They did this extensively during the Cold War as well. So we have these weird press gang multinational brigades that the Russians don't advertise that they're using as cannon fodder right along their convicts.
Hmm. Let's talk about the G7 and the deal to use profits from frozen Russian assets to provide around $50 billion by way of a loan to Ukraine.
That's kind of
You,
sexy.
Ukraine can never get too much, but getting enough right now does look like it might just decide the outcome of the war. Do you think?
Every little bit helps, but to say one thing is going to be decisive when you've got a land war on a front that's over 1,500 kilometers long, I think, is a bit of a stretch. Using the interest from the frozen Russian investments, though, honestly, that was a stroke of genius. I don't know who came up with that one, but I want to buy them a drink because it basically finds a nice little loophole in international law that only pisses off the Russians and nobody else. I mean, that was very well done. Whether $50 billion in one pop and what will probably be around $10 to $15 billion a year moving on is enough to move the needle. I mean, it doesn't hurt. But, if Ukraine wins this, they're going to need $1 trillion US
Yeah,
of
I
reconstruction
suppose
funds
I
at a
mean
minimum.
not the $50 billion per se, but that if they get enough, if they get the kind of support they need right now, I mean, it could make all the difference, couldn't it?
I'm not sure that support is available. And I don't think it's a question of will or red lines. The United States, when it fights a war, it fights with reach and precision over volume. And the Europeans, for the most part, have pretended until very recently that war was in the past, and so they allowed their military industrial complexes to atrophy. We're now in a conflict that has more similarities with World War I than World War II or Vietnam or even much less the Desert Storm. And that means artillery, and that means building up the industrial plant that's necessary to build that artillery. And those processes are being developed, not just in the United States, especially in Europe, but it takes time. And $50 billion is really useful, but these things still aren't going to be providing the volume of artillery shells that the Ukrainians need this year or next year.
In terms of the G7 that's taking place now, the meeting that's taking place in Italy, I mean, they need this deal to show solidarity, don't they, amongst themselves? It's a time of political turmoil for a number of the countries there.
I don't think, well, I mean, mixing domestic European and international politics always makes an interesting cocktail. But there's not a lot of light among the G7 on these topics. And the fact that it was the Canadians who were the first major country to talk about basically confiscating the profits of Russian investments, that really lowers the bar for everyone else because the Canadians are the ones who are basically, we don't really contribute too much here except for respect for rule of law. And look, we found a way to get around that respect. So everyone else was like, "Sweet." Uh, so that's done, and any additional assistance is going to help with solidarity versus the Russians. But the issues that the Europeans are having for, say, the far right surge, they're going to have to deal with those in their own way. I'm really not worried about the French. Macron, by starting these new sorry, let me back up. The National Front did very well in European Union elections, and Macron immediately called snap elections for the parliament, which everyone was like, oh, he's going to lose everything. But now we've got a civil war going on among the French far right. So, Macron didn't get into his position by being a dumbass. This might work out really well for him if he can actually shatter the political hold and the aura of the far right. The Germans are a different situation. If you had new elections today in Germany, Schultz would absolutely lose. But because of the way their constitution works, the way we wrote their constitution, that's not a threat. He gets to serve out the remainder of the 3 years of his term. He's not going anywhere unless he chooses to leave. And that just leaves Italy, where it's the ruling party that won the EP elections. So all this gnashing of teeth we have in Europe about the EP, it's really not that big of a deal at this moment until you win in national elections and then prove that you're a little wackadoo. Everything's okay. The Italians have proven they're not wackadoo. The French are containing this. The Germans have 3 years left. They're fine.
You have a great turn of phrase for these things, Peter. I love it. Just want to turn to what President Biden said at the recent 80th D-Day commemorations. He made this impassioned speech about defending and saving democracy and drew direct parallels between the defense of Europe then and today. And he said the world's autocrats are watching. He drew direct links with Ukraine. What do the world's autocrats need to see?
They need to see the Russians not just humbled but destroyed. Autocrats are by nature hierarchical systems without a lot of support on the sides. And they are going to cherry pick whatever information they see, not just for their propaganda, but for their own internal processing. And it takes a really, really sharp hit to break through that layer of conscious distorting of reality within your own mind. And so A battlefield defeat for the Russians isn't going to change anyone's mind. But if you break the Russian system, that would.
Peter Zeihan, it's been great talking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now or listen to Times Radio or go to thetimes.co.uk. My thanks to our producer today, Louis Sykes, and to you for watching. Bye-bye.